Hello everyone, it's Liam. Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to share with you a little hat embroidery tutorial. So if you want to follow along, there'll be a link in the description box below where you can download the pattern that I used for today's video. I created this. It's nothing fancy, just a really simple pattern. It should be sized properly, so if you print it out on 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, it'll be the exact same size that I used in today's video. So supplies you need, I have a DMC floss cutter. This is great. You could also just use a pair of scissors. You're going to need a needle that you like to use. I like to use fairly small needles, so these are what mine look like. Then you're going to need your thread. For today, I used a darker, more saturated red and a lighter muted pink for the main parts of the flower. I then used black for the center and a darker blue for the outline. You can really use whatever colors you want for this flower, and it really does depend on your hat color. I thought red would go really well with the light blue hat that I'm using. So once again, if you want to follow along, there'll be a link in the description box below where you can download the pattern that I created for this little peony. Once again, if it's sized properly for an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, so if you print that out, it should be the same exact size that I used for my hat. So if you want to transfer it onto a hat or any other piece of fabric, you can really embroider this on a hat, a t-shirt, jeans, or just some extra fabric you have lying around. You don't have to do this on a hat, but it's just some ways you can transfer your design. I used charcoal. I just rubbed charcoal on the back of the piece of paper, and then I traced the lines on top, and it imprinted the image, and then I went over with a pen just so it would be a little more permanent. If you don't want to do that, you could use a light box, or you could either print on some backing, which I don't use, but if you have some embroidery backing, you can print on that and then just embroider with that on the surface. Since I was using a hat, the light box was really hard to use, so I ended up going the charcoal route. So one tip when you're using an embroidery hoop on the hat, if you're using a hat, it can be really difficult to set the embroidery hoop up. So make sure you put the embroidery hoop and your design an inch or two above the brim of the hat. It's really hard to get the embroidery hoop to get your design if the design's too close to the brim of the hat. So that's something I struggled with. I also think I struggled just because my embroidery hoop was so big. I think the embroidery hoop I used in this was 4 to 5 inches, and that was a little too big. I had a hard time getting it on the hat and covering my design, but after a while I figured it out. All right, so let's get into the actual embroidery. So if you haven't done embroidery before, you might have to look up what some of these stitches are, but I will briefly explain exactly what I'm doing here. So for every stitch I did, I actually split my embroidery floss into 3 strands. Embroidery floss typically comes in 6 strands, so I split each length that I used in half, so there'd be 3 strands, and then I threaded it through my needle and tied the end, and then I started embroidering. So the first thing I did was I took this really deep saturated red and I went around to the areas that I wanted to be darker or to be the shadows, and I did satin stitch. So if you don't know what a satin stitch is, it's basically an amalgamation of a lot of parallel stitches. So side by side, the same color of stitch, just really tight side by side. You'll get just a nice even, wash of whatever color you're using, and that's called a satin stitch because it looks really smooth and silky at the end. So I just went around to some areas in the deep red on the right side of the flower first, and then I ran out of the red that I had previously done, and so instead of just going and getting more red, I just decided to switch to the pink for a little while. So I grabbed this light pink and then I just went in. I basically did more satin stitches, but when I started off, it's the highlight area of the petals, so I actually did some threads in the satin stitch area I'd already done with the dark red, and then went out into the areas I hadn't stitched in yet and continued that satin stitch. Now, you might see me doing this in the video. When I do satin stitches, I actually like to spread them out a little bit and then just keep going back over them to smoothen it out. There's not really a reason for why I do this. It's just personally how I like to do a satin stitch. If you want, you can just do those parallel stitches really tight one after another, or you could do it like me. I'll do one and then I'll move over a little bit, do another one, and there'll be a gap between the two, and I'll basically just do a lot of spread out rows of the satin stitches until it fills out. Once again, I don't know why I do this, but I do. So you can see here I'm doing tying it off. So when I'm done, I usually leave about 3 inches of embroidery floss left. I know that's quite a lot. I don't think most people use that much or end that early, but I like to have a lot to work with because I always have trouble working that tiny and getting it tied off. And I always do about 3 knots. You can probably get away with 1 or 2, but I like to do 3 just to be extra safe. And then once I tie that, I'll cut the loose ends off because I'll usually have about 1.5 inches of loose thread after I tie off. So throughout this, I continue doing satin stitches in the areas where I want the deep red and then the light pink. So next we have the French knot stitch. These are so much fun. Oh my goodness. These are like my favorite stitch to do, and I'm sure you'll enjoy them too. So they're pretty easy. You just come up from the back. I'm using the back thread. You come out through, you then loop the thread around the needle once or twice, or I actually did 3 times I think in this, but it all depends on the size of the French knot you want. And then you go back through the hat or whatever you're embroidering on, next to where you came out of. Not the same hole, but near it, and it should create a nice little circle, rosy looking thing left. And you just do that a couple times until you fill out the area. Now before we go further in this video, I just want to remind you to like, subscribe, and hit the bell notification. I upload every single week, so make sure you hit that bell so you're notified next time I upload a video. And comment down below if you enjoyed today's video or plan on doing the project. I'd love to know, or if you have any questions, and I really appreciate all the support. Okay, so for my last step in this hat embroidery, I decided to do a back stitch all the way around the flower, as well as around each separate petal. So this just helps the flower really pop out from the hat. I decided to use a fairly dark blue thread. It's pretty similar to the hue of the hat, but it's just a little bit darker. So if you don't know what a back stitch is, you basically start out where you want on the edge of the flower somewhere. You go a little ways forward to place the stitch. My stitches tend to be about 1 centimeter or 0.5 centimeter on this hat. And then you're underneath the fabric and you go forward about another centimeter or 0.5 centimeter, depending on how long you want your stitches to be. You come up through, and then you go back, hence back stitch, to the end of the last stitch, and it just creates a continuous line of thread all the way through the design. So I not only did this around the flower to make it pop, but since the red and pink kind of blend together after a while visually, I decided to go back in and also outline all of the petals in the design, and this just really helped the flower to stand out. So I hope you enjoyed today's video and tutorial. If you want to follow along, once again, there's a download link down below. You can just print it off, transfer it onto your fabric, and get started. You can really use any colors of embroidery floss. You could use similar colors to me, or you could do something completely different depending on what color you're embroidering on. I really enjoyed doing this. I've never embroidered on a hat before, so this was a really fun experiment. Like I said, I hope you guys enjoyed. Make sure to like, subscribe, comment, hit the bell notification, and I will see you guys next week for another new video. Thank you. Bye.